Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking on a topic you hear constantly. Cancel culture. It's one of those phrases, isn't it?
It really is. Seems like everyone has an opinion, but maybe not everyone means the same thing by it.
Exactly, and that's what we want to get into. For some, it feels like a vital tool, for holding people accountable, pushing for social justice.
Right. Necessary consequences for harmful stuff.
But then you've got the other side, people who see it as, well, kind of like an online mob.
Yeah, like censorship or just going too far, punishing people unfairly.
So, given these really different takes, we figured it's time for a proper deep dive.
To really unpack it.
We've pulled together some interesting sources for this. We've got Pew Research Center data, Wikipedia's overview. What else?
There's a thesis on Filipino-American activism, an academic piece on Islamic cyberculture, resources from transformharm.org on transformative justice.
Right, and a study on student perceptions, plus bits from a book about communicating responsibly online. Quite a mix.
The goal isn't to say cancel culture is good or bad, definitively. It's more about understanding all these perspectives.
Understanding the mechanics, the impacts on different groups, and maybe looking at other ways to handle things like accountability.
Exactly. Explore the whole picture.
Okay, so first things first. What is it? Even defining cancel culture seems tricky. Pew Research really highlighted this, didn't they?
They absolutely did. Their work showed just how varied people's understanding is. Like 14% of people who knew the term basically defined it as censorship.
Wow, okay. Censorship or even erasing history.
Yeah, pretty strong views. Then another 12% saw it really negatively too, calling it sort of mean-spirited attacks.
Just designed to hurt people.
Seems that way, yeah. And Pew found other descriptions too. Some said it's just about shutting down disagreement.
Canceling anyone who thinks differently.
Or that it's just the natural consequence when someone gets called out. Others felt it was an attack on, like, traditional values.
Interesting. But not everyone saw it negatively.
No, some did see it as a way to finally call out important issues, racism, sexism, that kind of thing.
Okay.
While others felt the whole thing often just misrepresents what someone actually did or said.
So it's all over the map. The definition itself is kind of a battleground.
Pretty much. Wikipedia tries to give a more straightforward definition.
What's theirs?
They call it the practice of withdrawing support for or canceling public figures and companies after they have done or said something considered objectionable or offensive. Focuses on that withdrawal of support.
Right, pulling endorsements, followers, money, that sort of thing, which sounds clearer, maybe. But then a Morning Consult poll from 2020 showed just how common this actually is.
Yeah, that poll was revealing 40% of registered voters said they'd actually done that, withdrawn support because of something objectionable.
40%, that's significant.
And there was a big age gap.
Oh, yeah.
55% of the 18 to 34 crowd said they'd done it, compared to only about 32% of folks over 65.
Interesting generational difference there. Why do you think that is? Just more online.
Could be that. Could be different norms, maybe a different sense of urgency around social issues. Hard to say for sure.
The poll also showed people were really mixed on whether it's good or bad overall.
Right. More disapproved than approved, 44% to 32%. And almost half, 46%, felt it had gone too far.
Only 10% thought it hadn't gone far enough.
Yeah, but still, over half, 53%, believe that if you say something unpopular or offensive publicly, you should probably expect some kind of social consequences.
Okay, so there's a sense that actions have consequences, but disagreement on what those consequences should look like and how far they should go.
Exactly. Which brings us right back to that core question. Is this about accountability or is it just punishment?
And Pew looked at this divide too, right? Particularly regarding political views.
They did. They found Democrats were generally more likely to see calling people out publicly on social media as holding them accountable.
Making them answer for their words or actions.
Whereas Republicans, majorities of them, tended to see that same act as unfairly punishing people.
So a real partisan lens affecting how people interpret the same online behavior.
It seems so. Pew also identified 5 main points where people disagreed on why they felt that way.
Okay, what were those?
The biggest one, about a quarter of adults mentioned this, was about whether the people doing the calling out were rushing to judge.
Jumping to conclusions.
Yeah, versus genuinely trying to be helpful or educate. That was a key tension.
Okay, intent versus impact, almost.
Sort of. Then another 14% questioned if calling people out online is even, productive. Does it actually lead to positive change?
Or just more online fighting.
Right. And 10% brought up the free speech angle versus creating a safe or comfortable online space. Where's that line?
Always a tricky one.
Then you had 8% questioning the motives of the callers out. Are they genuinely trying to improve things, or is there some other agenda?
And the last point.
Just 4% debating whether speaking up publicly is even the best way to handle offensive stuff in the first place.
It's interesting that even people who do see it as accountability sometimes admit it can go wrong.
That nuance came through. Some said, yeah, it's about accountability, but acknowledged it can be, misplaced sometimes, or ineffective, or even just cruel.
Not a perfect tool, even for proponents.
And there's that tension between it being a teaching moment, about 17% saw that potential, versus unjust punishment that ignores context or intent, which 18% highlighted.
The intent piece seems really difficult online, doesn't it? Hard to know for sure.
Very hard. Which leads us to think about, okay, how does this actually work? What are the mechanics, the motivations? Transformharm.org has a pretty blunt take on it.
Oh yeah, what do they say?
They talk about it as, and this is their phrase, tearing someone or some group to shreds online.
Wow, okay. Direct.
Yeah, creating memes, writing critical takedowns, really deconstructing people publicly.
Almost like a public dissection.
Kind of. And they point to this feeling people might get of being better or morally superior by being on the right side.
Right, the self-righteousness angle. Does this tie into any psychological theories?
It does. The RSIS International study mentions attribution theory. Basically, it suggests we tend to explain someone's behavior by blaming their fundamental character, a dispositional attribution.
So if someone messes up, we think, oh, they're just a bad person.
Exactly, and that becomes the justification for canceling them. But the criticism is this often ignores the situation, the context, external factors. Maybe it was just a mistake.
It simplifies things too much, maybe.
That's the argument. Now, RSIS does acknowledge cancel culture can sometimes highlight important issues like systemic racism or sexism.
It can spark needed conversations.
Potentially, yes. But they also warn it's often driven by outrage.
Which can be powerful, but maybe not always productive.
Right. It might just push bad behavior underground instead of actually addressing it. Or it might prevent people from learning and growing if the focus is purely on punishment.
That focus on punishment over understanding, does that have wider effects?
Well, the study on Islamic cyberculture in Indonesia suggests it can. They found it could lead to an imbalance of opinions being expressed.
How so?
People might self-censor if they hold minority views, afraid of being targeted, which, limits the diversity of thought online.
Creates an echo chamber almost.
Could do, yeah. And the CRIST resource, focusing on communication ethics, calls social media potentially a tool for destruction of individuals.
Strong words again. They emphasize media literacy then.
Hugely. Being able to navigate all this information and misinformation critically.
Okay, so lots of potential problems raised. What about alternatives, solutions? Transformharm.org seem critical. What do they suggest?
They really push asking why. Why did the harm happen? Let's understand the root causes.
Get beneath the surface.
Exactly. It connects to transformative justice, which isn't just about the individual act of harm, but asks, what conditions in society allowed this to happen, and how do we change those conditions?
So a much bigger systemic approach, not just focusing on one person.
Right. It's about transforming the situation, not just punishing the person.
What other alternatives came up?
RSIS International also leans towards education over punishment, finding a balance that encourages learning, self-reflection.
And they mentioned restorative justice, too.
Yes. Restorative justice is more about repairing harm, bringing together the person harmed and the person who caused harm, if possible and safe.
To understand the impact.
And figure out how to make amends. It prioritizes empathy, understanding, reconciliation, rather than just punishment.
That sounds quite different from a typical online pylon.
Very different. And the thesis on Filipinaxo American activism offers a really concrete example of grappling with this.
Within activist groups themselves.
Yeah. They saw how cancel culture-like dynamics could cause conflict, push people away, so they tried to find other ways.
What kind of ways?
Focusing on intentional community building, addressing conflict without dehumanizing people, trying to continually improve how they relate to each other.
And they mentioned care work.
Yes, really emphasizing material support, emotional support, collective well-being as a response, not just to external pressures, but also internal conflicts like this.
Building solidarity as an alternative.
Exactly. They talk about mutual aid, extending care. There's a story about a community rallying around an activist named Brandon Lee after he was harmed.
Showing support instead of abandonment.
Right. And another example of a student group working internally to address sexism within their own ranks rather than just calling people out and pushing them out.
So internal work, community focus. What about the Islamic cyberculture perspective? Did they offer solutions?
They did, rooted in Islamic values, emphasizing building a strong digital identity based on things like simplicity, justice, respecting diverse opinions.
Using faith principles as a guide for online behavior.
Pretty much. They also mention impression management, being conscious of how you present yourself online, and specific Quranic verses about speaking truthfully and justly.
Interesting. Using ethics to navigate the online space.
Yeah, as a way to avoid both being canceled and participating in cancellation culture in harmful ways.
And finally, the Christ resource on communication.
Their focus is on communicating responsibly, motivated by love for your neighbor, essentially. Being discerning consumers of information, being media literate.
Thinking about the impact of our words.
Definitely. Considering things like framing, cognitive load, how much information people can handle, and approaching communication with humility and grace.
Focusing on the whole person in communication, thoughts, feelings, body relationships.
Right. It's a more holistic view of how we interact, even online.
Okay, so wrapping this all up,
Yeah.
it's clear cancel culture isn't simple. It's complex, deeply contested.
Lots of definitions, complex motivations, real consequences, both good and bad, intended and unintended.
And while it's often presented as being about accountability,
Our sources show it's frequently seen and felt as punishment or censorship.
but crucially, there are other ways being discussed and practiced.
Absolutely. Transformative justice, restorative justice, building cultures of care, they all point towards understanding root causes, focusing on learning, growth, reconciliation.
Rather than just immediate condemnation.
Yeah. And ethical communication online, needing that media literacy, empathy, focus on constructive dialogue.
It really requires thoughtfulness.
It does.
So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. As we all try to figure out accountability in this digital age, in our communities online and off, how do we build spaces that actually prioritize growth and understanding and real transformation?
Instead of just defaulting to that immediate, often harsh condemnation we see so much, how do we foster something more constructive?